right, thanks for coming out. Welcome, my name is Matt McDonald. I'm an elder here at Grace Fellowship Community Church, and we're really happy to be able to hosting Mark this weekend. In addition to tonight, Mark will also be giving the sermon during our Sunday worship, which starts at 10 a.m. on Sunday, so we'd love to have any of you come out and join us for that. Tomorrow, Mark has some events that are down in the South Bay, and he can give you more information on that later if you're interested in taking a drive down there. But we're very happy to have Mark here. I think most of you probably are familiar with Mark a little bit, but just some highlights. Mark is author, activist, comes from the Navajo Nation, predominantly near Gallup, New Mexico is where he grew up. And his first book, Unsettling Truths, it came out a few years ago, still selling very well. And I know Mark's hard at work on his second book, and I think we're going to hear tonight some ideas that are going to be in his second book, and even his third book that he's already planning, even before finishing his second book. So we get to hear some of that before it gets launched. And up on the screens, we got some QR codes if you want to follow more of Mark's comings and goings across the country and even internationally sometimes. You can see that, as well as a big library of a lot of his writing and his videos and his very active YouTube channel. So, Mark, thanks for coming, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you tonight.
Well, thank you, Matt, and I'm glad people are here. I did not know how many people were going to turn out tonight. I told Matt that we could have 5 or we could have 50, so we have 5. So this is good. I'm actually excited to talk to you about some of these things. But before I begin, let me do like I always do whenever I speak, which is just introduce myself. So, Yat Mark Charles Yinishya. Sin beke dene nishle dotor higlini bashchin sin beke dene dasha chater to chini dasha nala. In our Navajo culture, we're going to introduce ourselves. We always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineals of people. Our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, which is why I say sin beke dene nishle. Loosely translated means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbeke. My fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochini, which is the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge that here in San Francisco, we are, and I hope I pronounced these correctly, we are on the lands of the Mawakima, the Ohuloni, and the Rema Yitush. And these are the native nations that they were living here and hunting here, farming here and fishing here, long before both either Columbus got lost at sea or the Spanish came up from the south. And many of these nations are still here, so I want to acknowledge these nations as the hosts of these lands. I want to thank these nations for their stewardship of these lands, and just state how humbling it is for me to be here, eating, living, moving, breathing, working on these lands today. So, a kahat to my relatives who have been stewarding these lands for a long time. I also just want to talk to you a little bit about who I am and what I do. So, I am a graduate of UCLA. As was said earlier, I wrote my first book, Unsettling Truths, The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. That book is really looking at how did the nation and the churches misuse the scriptures to justify things like genocide, enslavement, ethnic cleansing, manifest destiny. I was asked many times after that book came out, why did you not critique the genocide in the Bible, where God told the people of Israel to kill everyone living in Canaan? And I said, well, because this book is looking at how the scriptures were misused, we're not critiquing the Bible itself. But my second book, Decolonizing Faith, which I'm writing right now, is looking at those issues. It's looking at what does it say about our faith and what do we do with the aspects of our faith that advocate for this type of violence, where God told the people of Israel when they went into Canaan to leave nothing alive that breathed, kill every man, every woman, every child, every animal that was living there. And what do we do with that? And so my second book is looking at those issues, and the sermon I'm preaching on Sunday is called Radical Inclusivity. It's from Acts 10. And that sermon's actually going to be the first chapter of my new book. And what I'm looking at in that sermon is in our churches, we're kind of trained to read the Bible through a Jewish versus Samaritan lens. Right? So the Samaritans, they were the ones who were half-breeds. They were the ones who worshipped on the mountain, not in the temple. They were probably the reason the people of Israel were being persecuted by the Romans. And so the Romans disliked, even hated the Samaritans and didn't go into their lands and didn't have anything to do with them. Jesus changed that, right? He went through Samaria intentionally. He ate with Samaritans. He preached to Samaritans. He even made them heroes in his parables. When you look at the Samaritans Jesus through a Jewish versus Samaritan lens or paradigm, Jesus seems very inclusive. But none of us are Samaritans. Or at least most of us aren't. I don't know, all of us. We're Gentiles. And what I'm looking at in this sermon is how did Jesus interact with Gentiles as compared to Samaritans. And he actually had a very different style of interacting with Gentiles than he did with Samaritans. He was much more hands-offish with Gentiles. And so we're going to examine that in this sermon. And the reason we're doing that is because if I begin critiquing the Old Testament of the Bible immediately, people will say, well, Jesus changed everything. So I have to first shift our paradigm about Jesus. Not to reject Jesus, but to look more honestly at who he was and what he said and what he did. And then wrestle with what does that mean for us as people of faith. And so that's the first chapter of my next book. Now, I've been working for a while. Not all of you know me, but in the last year and a half or 2 years of my life, I've radically changed my health. I have lost over 55 pounds. I have changed my sleep. I've changed the way I breathe. I changed the way I eat. I changed the way I move. I have changed my circadian rhythm. I have radically changed my health in the past 2 years. And as I've gone through that process, anyone here ever tried to change their health? Anyone here have a friend who's tried to change their health, right? I mean, there's tons of books out there, right? And they all overpromise. If you eat this way or don't eat this way, if you exercise this way or don't exercise that way, if you do this or don't do that, if you breathe like this or sit like that, you will be healthy, you'll be beautiful, you'll be prosperous, and you'll live to be 99 or 100 years old. All these books aren't wrong, but they also aren't right either. And when you start reading these books, you have to find a way to filter them. And so, as I was going through trying to change my health, and as I was reading a lot of books and looking for a way to filter them, I realized frequently the filter I was using was, what did my Navajo people do? Or how did my Indigenous people live? Or how were we before we were colonized? And I found when I read these books with that filter, it gave me a pretty strong place to say, okay, that makes sense, that doesn't make sense. I can buy that, I'm not going to buy that. And it allowed me to understand more fully what was going on in those books. And so it started me thinking about, what do I need to do for my health to not only get healthier, but to live and to stay healthier? And that, I'm going to talk more about this later, but that's what got me onto this whole idea of what I'm calling now decolonizing my health. And so we're going to talk about that. A little bit more about me. I love coffee. I have a podcast called My Second Cup of Coffee. I do it about once a week. I try to shift the paradigm on our politics, on our social interactions, and on our faith. I drink 2 cups of coffee a day, and it's usually during my second cup that I do the podcast, which is why I call it My Second Cup of Coffee. And I love coffee. I'm a coffee connoisseur. I have been using, when we lived on the reservation, I used the French press. Well, I started drinking Folgers. My boss got me into Starbucks. I went to Seattle and got into the gourmet coffees. And then I started using a French press. And then my friend bought me an AeroPress. And now we use a pour over. And I am very much a coffee snob. But I tell people I drink coffee like Jesus would, which is I either like it boiling hot or ice cold. If it's lukewarm, I'm going to spit it out of my mouth. So I model my coffee drinking after Jesus. So I do my second cup of coffee, and that usually goes out there once a week. And also, I need to let you know I'm an Android person. So I know we're in San Francisco, kind of the tech center, and there's a lot of back and forth about Apple versus Android. I'm warning you about this because I love my Android phone. I may say a few passive-aggressive things about Apple occasionally during this presentation, so just listen closely. And one of the reasons I have to say this is because, anyone fly, when you fly, and they have these rules about your technology, and so you sit down and they say, okay, please put your laptops away and just have something handheld. And so usually I'm sitting next to someone, and they'll be, they'll have their MacBook out in front of them, and they're watching something on there, and they'll put that away, and they'll put that in their bag, and then they'll pull out their Apple, their iPhone 15 or whatever the newest one is, iPhone 13 I think it is now. And so they'll watch their movie on that while we take off, and then we get to 10,000 feet, and they say, oh, you can take out your bigger things now, so they'll put that away and take out their iPad, and they'll watch it on their iPad, and then they're sitting there and they say, oh, I forgot I have to do this email for work, so they'll put that away and take out their MacBook, and they'll be working on their MacBook, and then they're like, oh, I gotta make a graphic, so they'll put their MacBook away and get their MacBook Pro out, and they have one backpack, right? There's $20,000 worth of Apple products in their backpack. And I'm sitting there with my one phone, and I'm like, I have one thing, and you pulled out $20,000 worth of equipment here. But I think it's because I think Apple people feel a little bit insecure. That's what I think it is. Apple's a $3 trillion company. You don't get to be a $3 trillion company unless you learn how to sell your product really well and get people, Apple is more popular in the US than globally. I think in the US we're about a 60% Apple population. It's much lower. Most people use Android globally. And so Apple makes a lot of money off of Americans, and they do it by selling them the very next product. But I think Apple people are a bit jealous because they don't have a verb, right? Google has a verb. You Google something, and that you look, I'm going to Google something. My Apple people, anyone here, they don't have to identify yourself, but you don't have a verb. So I want to give you a verb, okay? I'm gonna give you my Apple verb. There's a consumer version, and there is a institution version. The Apple verb is the compulsion to buy the latest version of a product, no matter how expensive the product, how slight the improvement, or how recent the previous version was released. That's what it means to be Appled. There's an incorporated version of the verb, which is the ability to sell the latest version of a product, no matter how expensive the product, how slight the improvements, or how recent the previous version was released. So if you have a friend who likes to rent or who likes to lease cars, because they always want to be driving the latest and greatest car. And so we all know that's not a good financial investment. You're wasting your money. But if you have a friend who's insistent on leasing a car and getting the newest car every year, you can tell them pretty confidently, yeah, you've been appled, right? That's how, I'm just giving you an example of how the verb works, okay? That's how the verb works. We're in a church, right? We all know the creation story. Adam and Eve are tempted and they sin. You essentially could say Adam and Eve got appled by Satan, okay? I'm just giving you examples of how the verb would work. So it may come up a few times during the presentation, but I just wanted to kind of bring my Apple people into the fold here. But anyway, let's talk about some of this, what I want to call decolonizing health. One of the other things that I love to do as well is I love to watch the sunrise. If you've read the first chapter of the introduction of my book on sowing trees, you'll hear me talk about how watching the sunrise is one of the most meaningful spiritual disciplines I've ever done in my life. It's radically transformed my relationship with the Creator. It's one thing to see the sunrise on Easter morning or when you have an early flight, but when you watch the sunrise day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and eventually decade after decade, it does something deep to your soul. When you see the seasons change, the birds migrating, the flowers blooming, the leaves falling, the snow's coming, the snow melting, as you see all these things happen, what it does in your soul is it communicates at a very deep level that you're not in control. You can't make the sunrise faster, you can't make it go slower. It happens whether you're there or not. And it's just a very, very powerful thing. The other thing I love about the sunrise is no matter what I've done in the previous 24 hours, no matter what my nation has done in the previous 24 hours, no matter what the world's done in the previous 24 hours, every single morning, no matter what's happened in the previous 24 hours, the sun rises. And we have another opportunity to walk in beauty with our neighbor, with our environment, with the people around us, even with people who are opposing us. Every single morning we have another opportunity. And seeing that and understanding that, I've watched the sunrise in Haiti, I've watched it in Guatemala, I've watched it in Siberia, I've watched it in New Zealand and in Hawaii and other places all around the globe. I've watched it in Washington, D.C., I've watched it during the Trump administration, during the Obama administration, during the Biden administration. It always rises. And that, to me, no matter what's happened in the previous 24 hours, whether we've dropped bombs on people or killed foreign leaders or whatever else, every single morning we have another opportunity. And it speaks to me deeply about the mercies of Creator. The third thing I love about watching the sunrise, I do it in DC along the Potomac. This picture here is of me on the Navajo Nation. And I love the reminder it is that I'm a part of creation. And there is one Creator, and everything else was created. And it's very humbling to realize I'm no better, I'm no worse than anything else that's out there that was created. We were all created by the same Creator. And we are all a part of this creation. And we are all here, a part of this together. And it's a wonderful, humbling reminder to me to see that. Well, I need to change something really quickly here so I can use presenter view. I have to change this. Okay. So about this topic of decolonizing health. In her book, Movement Matters, biomechanist Katie Bowman wrote these following, or she was talking in her book about how science is reductionist. And what science does is it specializes and it zooms in and it gets down to a very small component. So if you want to be a doctor, right, you study biology, and then you go on to study human anatomy. And then after that, you study maybe the respiratory system. And then after that, you study a part of the respiratory system. And soon you zoom in on this one upper lobe of the left ventricle of the lung of something. And you become the expert on that thing. And that's your specialty, and you serve patients and help people all around the world based on your knowledge of that one little tiny component. And that's a great way to understand how that component works. But the problem, Katie Bowman points out, is that that's not how the body works, right? The body is not just a bunch of little tiny components. It's a living, breathing organism that moves and works together, and it's much more holistic. And in her book, Movement Matters, she wrote this. She said, "I would suggest that a group of humans has never been this sedentary," talking about Western American lifestyle, "and survived. We have no idea how to move, and so we are turning to science to show us. P.S. That's not science's role at all. But when you have an elder-free society, you have to turn somewhere, and scientific data is where many of us are turning." I want you to think about that sentence for a moment. When you have an elder-free society. Now, I didn't see Katie Bowman expand on this further in her book. I haven't talked to her personally. I'm hoping to invite her onto my podcast at some point where we can go more in depth to this. But when I read that sentence, I don't know how she meant it when she wrote it, but I knew how I read it as someone who has studied the doctrine of discovery. Let me start by just kind of helping you, bring you into my understanding of what it means when she says, when you have an elder-free society. The first thing I want you to do is, if you have your phone with you, I want you to Google the definition of the word nature. Google the definition of the word nature. Anyone have it on their phone? If you have an Apple with you, please don't Siri it. I don't need you talking to your phone right now. But Google the definition of the word nature. Anyone have it? Go ahead, Matt. Can you read it for us?
Okay. This is what my phone says. The phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to humans or human creation.
Think about that for a moment. Thank you, Matt. How does it define nature as compared to humans? We're separate, right? Nature is separate from humans and separate from our creations. Think about that. We live in a world, in a culture that defines nature and humans as being two separate entities. So everything I was just saying about the sunrise and how watching the sunrise makes me feel closer to Creator and makes me feel a part of this world and this natural world that I'm in. And yet, the worldview of Western culture does not define nature and humans as being in the same thing. That is a very, very important observation, whether you're thinking about why we struggle to take care of the environment, or why we even struggle to treat nature with any sort of care or concern. We see ourselves as completely separate. We do not see ourselves, Western culture, I should say, doesn't see itself as part of the food chain. And we can see this very clearly. There's a great documentary out there. It's called Homeland. It's about different native nations and their struggle to maintain their homelands. And one of the nations they looked at are the Athabascan people who live up in Alaska. Trump just renamed their mountain back to Mount McKinley from Denali. But the Athabascan people, they live in the Arctic Circle, they hunt the caribou, and in their creation story, they are told that there is a piece of the human heart in the caribou, and there's a piece of the caribou heart in the human. So the two form a bonded relationship where they need each other to survive. And they were interviewing the leader of the Athabascan people, and he said, yeah, environmentalists love us because he said it doesn't matter if we're in famine, it doesn't matter if people are starving, it doesn't matter if we're on the brink of starvation. We never hunt the caribou when they head north. Every spring, the caribou head north to calf, and then in the fall, they head south to winter. And he said, we never hunt the caribou, no matter what's going on in our communities. We never hunt the caribou in the spring when they head north to calf. And he said, the environmentalists love us because how we're treating the caribou with such respect. He said, but then they're terrified, they're horrified at us when we freely hunt the caribou when they head south. And he said, yeah, it's because we need the caribou. We need their meat to nourish us. We need their furs to keep us warm. We don't overhunt them. We don't hunt them when they haven't given birth to their calves yet. That would send them into extinction. We couldn't be in relationship with them that way. But we need to hunt them respectfully because we need them to survive otherwise. And that's the challenge with many environmentalists today, is they think that somehow we have to preserve nature around us and not live in a sustainable relationship with it. Again, this is part of the definition of how Western culture views nature, which is we don't need it and it doesn't need us. We will hurt nature, nature will thrive without us, and so we have to be separate from it. And that's not a healthy way to view nature. We need to be a part. We are a part of the food chain, whether we like it or not. And what we do or do not do in the natural world absolutely has an impact. We cannot just extract ourselves from it and think the world can go on in the way it was designed or evolved to go on. So that's one aspect about an elder-free society. Another aspect of an elder-free society comes from the doctrine of discovery. You've heard me talk about this before. The doctrine of discovery, a series of papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, says things like invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. It's the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman, and their land is yours to take. This is the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa and colonize the continent. They did not see them as human. It's the same doctrine that let Columbus land here on the shores of Turtle Island and claim to have discovered it. The first sentence of Unsettling Truths in the first chapter says you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited. You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands, but you can't discover them unless your worldview tells you that the people living there are not fully human. So the doctrine of discovery is a white, male, supremacist, and Christian nationalist doctrine. That's the fruit of a church that has prostituted itself out to the empire. This also goes into what it means to have an elder-free society, when you have one group of people able and willing to dehumanize another group of people. That gives you the criteria for creating an elder-free society. Another way we want to look at this is through the legacy of this man, Abraham Lincoln, a man many people consider to be the greatest president in our nation's history. But my people, the Navajo people, have a very different relationship with Abraham Lincoln than most non-Native peoples have. You see, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed two bills. He signed the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act. The Homestead Act allocated 160 acres to anyone willing to go west and homestead for 5 years. The Pacific Railway Act allocated land and resources to complete the Transcontinental Railway. After signing those bills in 1862, in 1863, his General Carleton in the Southwest, gave this order that every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner. They were going to send them to the Bosque Redondo, where we will pursue you or destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or you move. There's going to be no other talk on this subject. Kit Carson and other Army captains went through our lands. They hunted our people. They destroyed our homes. They burned our crops. They butchered our livestock. In the book of the Navajo by Raymond Friday Locke, he wrote, by the middle of December, most of the weak and the aged had died. There's hardly a Navajo family that cannot remember tales of an aged grandfather, of a pregnant mother, or a lame child that had to be left behind when the camp had to be quickly deserted. The patrols were not interested in taking captives. It was too much trouble to transport them back to the forts. Any Navajo they saw was shot on sight. Mothers were sometimes forced to suffocate their hungry, crying babies to keep their families from being discovered and butchered by an army patrol or taken captive by them, by slave raiders. They went through our lands, rounded up nearly 10,000 of our people, and forcibly marched us to Bosque Redondo. Hundreds of our people died of starvation and exposure during this removal. In the book, It Buried My Heart at Wounded Knee, D. Brown writes, it was a wretched place, they said. The soldiers prodded them with bayonets. To shelter themselves, they had to dig holes in the sandy ground. They lived like prairie dogs in burrows. It was a bad place, and escape was difficult under the watchful eyes of the soldiers. Yet many risked their lives to try and get away. Nearly a quarter of our people died. Over 2,000, almost 2,300 people died in the conditions. They called this a reservation, but it wasn't a reservation. It was literally a death camp that had been approved by none other than Abraham Lincoln in 1864. A few months later, in the spring of 1864, he signed the second half of the Pacific Railway Act, which gave more land and resources and gave the mineral rights to the railroad companies to incentivize them to build faster. In total, over the 3.5 years after he signed those bills, these 4 major genocidal ethnic cleansing massacres happened. The removal of the Dakota 38, or the hanging of the Dakota 38, and the removal of the Dakota from Minnesota, the Bear River Massacre, the Navajo Long Walk, and the Sand Creek Massacre. The Sand Creek Massacre happened in November of 1864, November 29. And 8 days later, on December 6th, Abraham Lincoln was giving his annual address. And in his address, he stated that 1.5 million acres were entered under the Homestead Law and the great enterprise of connecting the Atlantic with the Pacific States by railway and telegraph lines has been entered upon with a vigor that gives us assurance of success. He was very confident they were going to complete Manifest Destiny. He was positive they were going to do it. Why? What made him so positive? Well, this is a map of the railway. The primary route of the railway had reached Omaha, Nebraska, going through the center part of the U.S. It had to go through Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and come out near San Francisco. There was a northern route that went from Duluth, Minnesota, through Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and came out near Seattle, Washington. And a southern route going through the territory of New Mexico, the territory of Arizona, came out near LA. After the removal of the Dakota Winnebago from Minnesota, the Bear River Massacre in northern Utah and southern Idaho, the Long Walk in the Four Corners area, and the Sand Creek Massacre in eastern Colorado, you can see Abraham Lincoln had effectively just ethnically cleansed the northern, central, and southern routes of the railway. And the railway was always the goal. when they forced us to sign a treaty with them to bring us back to our lands in 1868, they stated very clearly that the condition of the treaty was that we will make no opposition to the construction of railroads being built or hereafter to be built across the continent, and that we will not interfere with the peaceful construction of any railway or not passing over our reservation as herein defined. So the whole goal was to ethnically cleanse these lands to make way for the completion of manifest destiny. On top of that, in the 1860s and 1870s, you can see during the assimilation period, traditional healthcare practices, i.e. the ceremonies of Native nations, were outlawed. We were no longer allowed to practice our traditional ceremonies. In the 1890s, the US was tiring of actual ethnic cleansing and genocide and decided to go about it a bit differently. And we decided to now try to kill the Indian to save the man by creating boarding schools. And so we stole children from their homes, put them into military-style boarding schools, punished them for speaking their languages, and punished them for practicing their culture, creating a complete separation and disconnect from one generation to the next of Native children from their parents and grandparents. Our relatives, this is how you make an elder-free society. When you are undocumented immigrants coming from Europe with a doctrine that tells you you are superior and everyone else is inferior, and you can discover lands that are already inhabited. When you then go across those lands and ethnically cleanse the people who are living there and destroy them based on your own self-proclaimed manifest destiny. When you then outlaw their religious practices and their ceremonies, and then for any of the few remaining survivors after all of that genocidal activity, you then intentionally rip apart the younger generation from the older generation and place them in a whole separate culture. And when you do that, you will have created an elder-free society. Because white people are not the elders. They know nothing about this land. They don't own this land. Their creation stories don't take place in this land. They weren't even born in this land. They have no legacy or heritage to these lands. And now they have killed, ethnically cleansed, forcibly assimilated, and culturally separated the generations of anyone who might possibly be able to play the role of elder in this continent. Now, what this conjures up in our minds is pictures of a very powerful, strong, and superior white culture, and a very feeble and savage and inferior native culture, much like we see in the photos right here. But I want to give us a different picture of that dynamic. This picture comes from George Catlin. George Catlin is a contemporary of Lewis and Clark. He actually served under Clark when he was head of the BIA after their expedition. And like Lewis and Clark, he went north, or we went west into the frontier. He was there longer than Lewis and Clark, traveled more miles, and visited way more Native nations than Lewis and Clark ever did. Spent 6 years traveling. He was an artist, and he gives us some of the best pictures of pre-colonized Native faces and people and cultures because of the people he met. He didn't go to colonize, he didn't go to subjugate, he didn't go to oppress people. He went literally to meet the people and get to know them. He has entire displays at the Smithsonian and other museums around the country with his artwork of the people that he painted. I want to read to you, this is a few screens, but I want to read to you from a book about George Catlin and about his observations of the native peoples he went to meet and he got to know during his 6 years traveling. He went up the Missouri to live with the Lakota Sioux. He met with the Pawnee, Omaha, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet. Along the banks of the upper Missouri, he happened upon the civilization of the Mandan, a mysterious tribe whose members stood 6 feet tall and lived in bubble-shaped houses. Many had luminous blue eyes and snow-white hair. Catlin realized that nobody really knew about the Mandan or other Plains tribes because no one of European descent had bothered to spend time talking to them, researching them, living with them, and learning about their beliefs and traditions. I am traveling this country, as I have before said, not to advance or prove theories, but to see all I am able to see and to tell it in the simplest and most intelligible manner I can to the world, for their own conclusions, Catlin wrote. He would print some 600 portraits and take hundreds of pages of notes, forming what famed author Peter Matheson would call the first, last, and only complete record ever made of the Plains Indians in the height of their splendid culture. The tribes varied region by region, with different customs, traditions, and diets. Some, like the Mandan, ate only buffalo flesh and maize, while others lived primarily on venison and water. Still others harvested plants and flowers. The tribes looked different too, with varying hair colors, facial features, and skin tones. And yet Catlin marveled at the fact that all 50 tribes seemed to share the same superhuman physical characteristics. In some groups, such as the Crow and the Osage, Catlin wrote that there were few men at their full growth who are less than 6 feet in stature, and many of them 6.5, and others 7 feet. They all seemed to share a Herculean make of broad shoulders and barrel chests. The women were nearly as tall and just as striking. Having never seen a dentist or a doctor, the tribal people had teeth that were perfectly straight, as regular as the keys of a piano, Catlin noted. Nobody seemed to get sick, and deformities and other chronic health problems appeared rare to non-existent. The tribes attributed their vigorous health to a medicine, what Catlin called the great secret of life. The secret was breathing. Many Native Americans explained to Catlin that breath inhaled through the mouth sapped the body of strength, deformed the face, and caused stress and disease. On the other hand, breath inhaled through the nose kept the body strong, made the face beautiful, and prevented diseases. The air which enters the lungs is as different from that which enters the nostrils as distilled water is different from the water in an ordinary cistern or a frog pond, he wrote. Healthy nasal breathing started at birth. Mothers in all these tribes followed the same practices, carefully closing the baby's lips with their fingers after each feeding. At night, they'd stand over sleeping infants and gently pinch mouths shut if they opened. Some Plains tribes strapped infants to a straight board and placed a pillow beneath their heads, creating a posture that made it much harder to breathe through the mouth. During winter, infants would be wrapped in light clothing and then held at arm's length on warmer days so they'd be less prone to get too hot and begin panting. All these methods trained children to breathe through their noses all day, every day. It was a habit they would carry with them the rest of their lives. Catlin described how adult tribal members would even resist smiling with an open mouth, fearing some noxious airs might get in. The practice was as old and unchangeable as the hills, he wrote, and it was shared universally through the tribes for millennia. This paints a very different picture. than a savage, weak, and despicable group of people. That the Native nations that Cal went out to meet, it was the white people who were sick, who were weaker, who had chronic diseases, who were breathing, gasping